Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. There's plenty of seats up in the front here if you're in the back standing. It's not a stand-up act, so I'm not going to pick on you just because you're sitting in a seat in the front here, I promise. I'm Bob Florian, VP of Engineering at SmartThings. I've been here for almost 6 years now. During a lot of that time, I was leading a group that was doing device integrations and automations. Most recently, I'm focused on helping to define the new developer experience for this next generation set of products that you have been hearing about and are going to be hearing more about.
I'm Vinay Rao. I'm the engineering manager for cloud-connected device integrations at SmartThings. I've been with SmartThings for about 4 years. I started with Zigbee device integration, spent a year doing LAN-connected device integration, and now I do cloud-connected device integration. So I've basically done every kind of device integration that SmartThings has to offer, and most of my focus has been around streamlining those integrations and making it easier for partners and within the company to add more compatible devices. So that's what hopefully this talk's going to be about.
Vinay's a triple threat, in other words. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about one method of connecting to the SmartThings cloud. This is going to apply to you if you have a device or working with a device that already perhaps is connected on Wi-Fi and connects to its own cloud. It may or may not have its own mobile app. But if that's the situation, you can build something called a SmartThings connector, and you can easily expose all of those devices to the SmartThings ecosystem. Why would you want to do that? We heard during the keynote, if you were there, that there are hundreds of millions of devices Samsung ships every year. A large number of those, all of the phones, all of the TVs, many of the fridges have SmartThings app built into them, and so you're going to get tremendous, give people a large number of people a way to access your devices kind of right out of the box. It's also an ecosystem that already has thousands of connected devices, and so you can look for applications that leverage your device and other devices to solve interesting problems for people in the IoT space. And also, when someone's out buying a television or something like that, that's a pretty big ticket item. There are opportunities for marketing if they can also buy a few light bulbs and have an automation where they can say, hey, it's Bixby, it's movie time, and the lights dim and the color changes. That's an attractive thing to do at the same time. If you were here last year, you might think that it's deja vu. Vinay and I were here talking about cloud-connected devices last year as well. And what we were talking about then was the Smart App Connector approach. And that still is a viable and valuable approach for certain classes of integrations. But in doing integrations ourselves in the intervening year, we found that they really come down to simpler things than you kind of had too many capabilities in the Smart App approach. And so what we've come up with is something called SmartThings Schema. And the idea here is to really streamline the effort, make it smaller, but without giving anything up. It's got full support of the SmartThings capabilities model. As an example here, it's a little bit small, you might not be able to see, but this will give you an idea of what a Smart App Connector is, for contrast. Most of the session we're going to be talking about ST Schema. This puts you in full control. There's a configuration set of events where you can define the user interface for onboarding your devices. You handle the OAuth flow. If you're doing something other than OAuth, you can handle that as well. That's optional. You manage the devices, you create the devices you want, you remove them if you need to. And you get events for device commands, which you need to implement, and you make calls to generate device events. I can't even read it myself here, but if you squint, this is a very simple actual integration. The code's elided a bit, but there's about 300 or 400 lines of code here, which is not a lot, but that's kind of typical of a small Smart App Connector. The ST Schema connector, we're looking at just breaking out the parts of this that are unique to integrating devices. And so this is going to be schema-based. And so you'll spend less time in the Developer Workspace creating device profiles for every variant of devices you have. You just need to define what they are in the schema. The UI is built in. You don't have to build pages. You don't have to worry about conforming to kind of, the kind of look and feel of the model. It's simplified. You don't have to worry about manually handling the OAuth. We handle that for you as well. But as I said, it still supports the full range of SmartThings capabilities, so you're not really giving anything up here. And in fact, to echo what was said earlier about Bixby at the keynote, this is the technology we're using to do all of our first-party integrations going forward, and so it is a case where something we're developed for our internal use is the same thing we're giving to you, and so it's we want to give you 100% of the capability to do these kinds of integrations.
Okay.
You want to talk? Vinay was going to talk a bit about getting into more details now.
So to make sure that it's all simplified, I think we start with the form, and the form itself shows how simplified the whole thing is. Most of the details that we are actually asking in the form is related to OAuth 2.0. So as long as you give us the client ID secret, the URLs for OAuth, the only other thing that we are asking for is whether you have hosted your connector in a Lambda or a webhook. We support both of them. And once you've filled out this information, what we do is you need to support the connector in Lambda or the webhook, and I can go through what the connector looks like. A brief description that I gave in the previous session was what we've seen for most partners is as they've started to integrate with multiple IoT platforms, it's nothing more than a JSON transformation exercise where you have your own data model in some form of JSON, and you're trying to figure out how does SmartThings, Alexa, Google, what is their JSON format, and you're converting between one and the other. And since that exercise has gotten repetitive, we've figured out that for most integrations, what it comes down to is you're discovering the devices. After OAuth is done, you have the user token. You're trying to discover all the devices that the user has. Once the discovery is done, you're trying to get the state of those devices. And once you get the state of the devices, the only thing remaining for automations, voice, and control in the app is commands. So if we made that as the only thing that was required, that's it. Your integration's ready, and you're ready to try something out with the SmartThings platform. So we've got the whole, Bob mentioned last year we did the integration where we showed off a SmartThings Slack demo along with a Tesla car demo, and in that case, we had to create all the device profile, the translations, all the UI pages. All of that is now taken care by the platform. This 80 lines of code, which I'll try to go at the end of this session, we'll go over how that is defining all of it, and every complexity that could have been taken away by the platform is now being done by the platform, so that all that you are managing in those lines is your business logic, your mapping logic. And as we work with more partners, what we figured out is even that is just a transformation exercise and not a business logic exercise. So we're trying to figure out how we can take that effort away too. So I think Bob will try to convey the other message as we figure out the next one.
Yeah, while Vinay is setting up here, we have a kind of a reputation, I think, sometimes of building more than one way of doing the same thing at SmartThings. That's not necessarily bad, but just to kind of reiterate, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, two choices, which should I do? I think it's pretty simple. If OAuth is built in, so if your third-party cloud uses OAuth, that makes you a candidate. And if all you're doing is integrating devices, if those two things are true, you should use SmartThings Schema. It's going to be a more consistent user interface. It'll be less work for you to do. It'll have the same performance and the same features. If that OAuth step, if either of those things is not true, then there is still the Smart App Connector approach, which again lets you build the same end result, but gives you more options and more flexibility. So for example, you might have an application that you want to have it control thermostats and monitor temperatures from devices inside the house. It's kind of a climate weather app, but you also want that app to build a virtual weather station device and install that in the SmartThings location. So if you have an app that wants to do those two kinds of things. That's the typical use case where you'd still want to build the SmartThings connector app that we described last year, and is still very much supported in the Dev Workspace. So once you build that app, what next? So in the last session, Magnus and Ted talked about this. These integrations are candidates for the Works with SmartThings certification program. In that case, you send us a certain number of devices, we test and certify it. You get to put the WWST logo when you're packaging, and you get premium placement in the catalog in the mobile app. However, these integrations will also be compatible for be candidates for SmartThings compatible. In that case, testing is up to you. You do the testing. You can register that device. It's going to be a fast path to getting into the catalog, and we're going to be rolling this out for all kinds of connections eventually. But cloud-to-cloud connections will be the first candidate. So with that, we're going to get into a few details.
Trying to make sure that the font is, I think that's good enough. So we can get started. The example that I have here is a LifeX integration. If you would like to play around with this, we've got a code lab session outside that the team is managing, where you get to play around with this and add more capabilities and see how simplistic it is. But the first thing that we get started after OAuth is completed is the discovery. So the reason, this is a Lambda integration, and what you can see here is it automatically calls the discovery request. If you look under the node modules on the left-hand side, there's something called ST Schema. So that's the helper library that we've created, so that if you export, we'll also publish this code to our Developer Workspace so that you can look at this template. And since LifeX APIs are public too, that way you can map between what's actually happening between the SmartThings cloud and the LifeX cloud. But for the most part, what line 65 here is module.exports, right? So this is where you essentially call the helper library and say, these are my the three request methods that need to be defined. And then the functions are invoked automatically when the correct request is sent. And what you see in case of discovery request is it's just about 4 lines of code where you're calling the helper function to build what the request needs to be to your cloud from the Lambda. And once you get the response back, you're just iterating through it. As we work with more partners, we are figuring out the JSON transformation and trying to put more of this in the config. But for now, they exist in code. So you get to see that all you're doing is you're creating a device, and then you're adding miscellaneous information like the manufacturer name and the model name. Next thing we have after discovery is done is the state of the device. So in this case, what you have is you make a call to get the state of the device. And once you're doing the same iteration again, I think before I move forward, one of the things that we ended up doing is, as we did the ST Schema work, we started working with more and more partners. We've worked with, so far, with LifeX, TP-Link, Sengled. We've started working with Brilliant, August Logs. And as we look at more of their data models, we were able to optimize it. The challenge for the team was sit in the evening and try to do an integration under 60 minutes. And as we tried to meet that goal, we figured out we had to constantly go through the code to change the API from LifeX to Sengled or to August Logs. And so we basically created this config file. So this config file is, again, fed into the helper library that we've created. But this is what let us achieve under 60 minutes of integration time, because what this does is you're clearly defining what the base URL is and the 3 requests are. Based on this, you can then easily switch between the template file and your real integration. So you're not even writing 80 lines of code. You're just editing the request config and the mapping here. So in your case, if your ID isn't called result.id and it's result.mac, because for most users it's the MAC address, then you can just change that around and you have your integration working. The idea with this template is so that you can quickly get started. The last part that we have is the command request. The command request is where we are mapping between, this is, by the way, the code lab exercise. This is the answer to the code lab exercise that we have outside. We've got mapping between SmartThings capability to whatever the partner capability is. Again, this is code where we had to write about, I think this is the biggest piece in our connector code. We are already working on a mapping function where you could define this in a JSON configuration. So the team's already looking at that so that instead of it being 10 lines of code, it's 1 line of code. But the idea here is you're mapping between SmartThings capability and LifeX's capability in this case, or in your case, it would be your partner capability. So once you've done this mapping, the request goes out, and based on if you send a request back, in case of LifeX, the only thing that's sent back is OK. So what you're then trying to do is convert the commands that came in and say that it all works. So there's a helper library for that, which is if you ask me to turn on the bulb, and if the partner is saying it did turn on, whatever was the command, say it's OK, and the whole JSON schema that needs to be created gets automatically generated as long as you send what the request was back to the helper library. The last thing I wanted to show after the 3 things are done is Bob talked about how we've got device profiles for the existing system where you're trying to create a device profile for a switch. So if there are 2 partners, what we had was both the partners would create a C2C switch, and they would have to do the translations and all of that. In case of LifeX, for the simple example, this is what's being done. If it has color, it sends that string value C2C RGBW color bulb, otherwise the color temperature bulb, and all of that mapping around the device profile creation, the translation for multiple markets that we are in, all of that is handled by the platform. So you as a partner are not worried about how do you scale or translate as we move into different countries, but rather what the capability mapping is. And once you get that piece right, about 80 lines, 78 lines in the final version. The hope is to get it even smaller, should be good enough. The next step here is, I think we can go back to the slides. So the next step here is you could take this template Lambda that we would publish in our Developer Workspace and try it out. One of the other things that we're also trying to publish, if you don't have a live device and you want to try out what the ST Schema is and how the calls are coming in, we'll also publish a virtual device connector so that you could just play around with it, see what the devices that come up look like. And you could put it either in your Lambda or a web service. Then you could go to the connector and set it up in Developer Workspace. One of the key things that we've done for this case, for this simplified integration is we've made a lot of mobile changes to make sure that the UI is more native, that the integration works seamless. And for a big dependency right now is we have in a few weeks, we'll have the monthly app update for SmartThings, and that's when the support is finally added for the simplified ST Schema. So once that is out, we'll have all the documentation and everything ready along with that.
Right, so where, next steps, as Vinay said, to actually use this and test it now, we're not quite there yet. We're looking at the next release of the SmartThings app on iOS and Android. That what?
About a few weeks.
Yeah, it should be imminent. You'll need that to install the application because, as Vinay said, it is a native UI. In the meantime, the SmartThings Developer Portal has documentation about ST Schema. That's smartthings.developer.samsung.com, if you can't read that. It has links to the Developer Workspace, so you don't have to remember both of those URLs. The portal has the documentation and other communication. The Workspace is the web-based tool for creating and registering Viper connectors, as well as Smart App connectors, if that's the path that makes sense for you. There's a code lab right out here. You can go and get some hands-on experience right now doing this, and there's also a demo booth where you can see the new Developer Workspace being demoed, and you can ask and get answers to your questions. And of course, we're going to have a Q&A here shortly. Feedback, I think they'll remind you on the way out as well, but you can use your app. We'd love to hear what you think about this session. Or we're always interested in direct feedback as well. And so we'll open it up to questions. Yes. We'll wait for the mic here.
Can you speak to the latency between sort of when something happens inside my home till goes to your cloud and comes to my cloud? Sort of how many milliseconds or seconds to expect?
We're seeing, there are a lot of variables in that. Obviously, your network connection. In some cases, it's what kind of devices. But we've been doing modeling of round trips with multiple cloud-connected devices. And seeing a latency definitely less than 2 seconds. It's not going to be quite as fast as connecting directly to your Zigbee bulb, but it's surprisingly fast. And
most of that latency is actually coming in. Okay, most of that latency is actually coming in. We've added more metrics around what percentage of that latency is SmartThings, and I think we are about under 500 milliseconds or somewhere around that number.
That also obviously depends on the other cloud service,
yes.
And we see a wide variation in some of those.
Yeah, for most of our partners, we've done 95th percentile on what that number looks like, and we've seen it vary from, we've had one partner under 80 milliseconds for their cloud-to-cloud integration to some partners taking over 3.5 seconds to respond back. So most of that latency number that the user ends up seeing is around how much latency is there between the SmartThings cloud, which is hosted in AWS, versus where your cloud is hosted.
Yeah, and so that 1.5 second number was actually a round trip with 2 devices and an app. So as you say, it's about a 500 millisecond penalty over top of whatever the cloud service itself provides.
Any questions?
Anything else? Oh, sorry.
Is there any limitations on the country that the cloud service can support? Like, if the IoT device is in, let's say, India, are you going to support that also?
It depends on where the SmartThings app is available. The way we are approaching this is, if the app is available in that country, there's no reason for us to not support C2C devices. Whereas Zigbee and Z-Wave, we've seen issues around every country has a different frequency band, so we need to find partners who have the right frequency band in that country without it being illegal in that country. As for C2C devices, it's just connecting to Wi-Fi, and as long as you are in that country, that is what makes it so much easier, because the app is right now in so many more countries than where our Zigbee Z-Wave devices are. And if your C2C device is in a country where the SmartThings app is available, we can then have a C2C integration for those customers without them having to wait for the hub to launch there or the Zigbee Z-Wave devices to launch there.
Thank you.
So if I understand the steps in the integration correctly, there's the SmartThings cloud will periodically query my third-party cloud for state updates of my devices?
We've made some changes on that. One of the old approach that we had with Groovy connected files where we were polling the partners every 5 minutes, which can get a little tasking once you start multiplying the number of devices and users for that particular vendor. So what we are doing instead is we are doing a 6-hour check-in to ask for if the new device has been added and the current state of the device, and that would be true for compatible devices. The ST Schema connector would be available both for compatible with SmartThings as well as certified with SmartThings. To be certified with SmartThings, your cloud will have to support state callbacks. So that would be added again as part of the documentation. But if you want to go from compatible with SmartThings to the front and center certified with SmartThings, the idea is if your bulb is acted on outside of SmartThings, your cloud would then inform us immediately that the state of the bulb has changed. So there won't be a 5-minute polling. It would be a 6-hour polling or somewhere in that range where it's not too tasking for you as a partner. But for certification, we'll have a better experience for our customers.
Yeah, so to be clear, like you can still do callbacks even if you're only compatible with SmartThings. It's just that we're making a requirement for the higher level works with SmartThings, because if we're doing a 6-hour polling, obviously you can't use that switch to trigger a routine, but you can control it immediately. So it's a requirement for Works with SmartThings. It's optional for compatible with SmartThings.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent.
Anything else? All right, thank you very much. We'll be around if you have questions one-on-one. Thanks again.
Thank you.